You're listening to the Alan Juddy Show, powered by Agricom, and a small AA battery.
I'm Alistair Moorhead, Portfolio Manager and Senior Agronomist.
And I'm Glenn Judson, Animal Nutritionist and Farm Systems Specialist. And we're here to help explain the technical, practical, and sometimes humorous implications of forages and animal systems. It's technical, made simple. G'day, Alistair. You're looking really well today.
Thanks, Juddy.
I was just looking around the studio. Actually, it looks a whole lot brighter in here, and that's probably because we've got a guest. Because it's normally not that bright when just you and I are in here.
Yeah, we're certainly not that bright.
So who we got today?
Oh, it's a great pleasure introducing Martin Hammer, our Head of Research from Australia. So welcome, Martin.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good morning.
Yeah, Juddy, I might get you to kick off because you and Martin are colleagues, so immediate colleagues.
Yeah, I guess with a slight realignment, Martin, you have been the research manager in Australia for some time, and I guess in a new role, I guess we're working a little bit closer together on some innovation projects that hopefully will bring some technology to the commercial world. So doing a little bit in terms of methane at the moment.
Oh, that's very cool. Very cool. Well, Martin's been with us for 14 years, actually, so he's a long-termer. And so I think you've got a couple of questions for us to get to know him a bit better.
Yeah, of course, with our guests, we normally ask some of the really hard-hitting questions first. So I guess, what do you like to cook, Martin? I know you are a bit of a connoisseur of food, so a bit of a foodie. So what do you like to cook?
Well, the current theme is decent stir fries, and trying to get a decent stir fry at home is actually rather difficult because you need an enormous amount of heat. It puts off an enormous amount of fat particles, which end up all over your house. And I actually have a blowtorch next to the stove that you blast the food with to get that sort of that wok flavor.
Oh,
so yeah,
oh, technical.
Yeah,
a technical stir fry.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And you're probably someone who doesn't mind a bit of spice and a bit of heat in that cooking.
Yeah. There's a large bag of bird's eye chilies on hand at all time in the freezer. So
excellent. And the other thing that really fascinated me actually is that recently you've had a go at deep diving. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, free diving. I suppose it's well, when you hit middle age, what are you going to do? You got to pick a new pursuit with your mates, and so yeah, me and a few mates decided that we'd take on a new challenge, and it turns out it's a really healthy one because you've got to if you're going to go out at 7 a.m. going for a free dive, you've got to look after yourself the night before, and it's all about concentration and skill. And really just learning to handle minutes without oxygen underwater, and it's quite relaxing.
So
just before you pass out.
Right. Oh well, this is the really interesting thing, right? So how deep did you get to?
Well, not far. I'm an absolute amateur, but the record so far is 28. My record, which is that's amateur hour compared to the most of the people that do it. But my mate Rachel, her record was 26 and a half. So I absolutely had to push for that last 2 meters, and it felt like my vice was in it, and my head was in a vice. But managed. So
28 meters, that's still a long way.
Well, for someone who flaps around the top of the top of the water,
in my case, wallows around the top.
Yeah.
And you convert that into things like scallop and abalone, diving, and really good recreational activities with mates.
So the other really interesting part about that was the length of time that you can actually hold your breath. Where did you get to with that?
Yeah, so far we're up to 3 minutes 47 with the head underwater, which it's not far off the point the instructor starts to get a little bit worried.
So, and the really interesting point about this, Alistair, and this really fascinated me, was the desire to breathe. When you hold your breath in, is actually a response to buildup of CO2. But actually, you've still got enough oxygen, right, in terms of bodily function. So it's not like you're gonna actually, this is gonna cause you some problem.
So the buildup of CO2 though is an impulse reaction thing, of which you can train.
Correct. And so it's your brain going, So you're well away from
Feedback
actually-
loop.
Yeah, it's a feedback loop. And so obviously Martin's been able to trade that feedback loop to go, I'm okay. I can still be it, which is, I guess, the calming.
Yeah, it's quite sort of meditative because you're learning that your body's response to that CO2 is just a signal that you have increasing CO2 in your blood, and that is virtually of no consequence for another minute and a half.
Until it really, really, really is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic.
So when someone says to you, Martin, don't hold your breath, you know, well, I can.
Yeah.
Because I can hold it for quite a long time, longer than you can. So
Classic.
excellent. Oh, that's really good. So I guess, what do we want to talk about with Martin today in terms of the expertise?
Well, Martin received a Churchill scholarship in Australia in 2017. And I think it's a really interesting one, Martin, because you then went off on you got an opportunity to travel. We've been discussing that and pre-recording, and got an opportunity to travel. And unless I'm mistaken, the aim of the event was to look at evaluation systems from around the world. And so, you know, what sort of built that desire and that thing? Obviously, you're the head of the research group in Australia, pastoral research group for our company.
Yeah, I suppose I was really, or am really enthusiastic about the role that marketplace transparency can play in innovation. You see people trying to cause innovation in pasture products through fundamental research, and there is, and then you look at our customers and farmers, and a lot of them are choosing through no fault of their own products that won't have them at the sort of frontier of product performance and won't have them maximizing their on-farm outcomes. And then you dig back and you think why, and it's because the information about product performance is simply not getting to them. And then the long-run implication of that information not existing is that you get less private sector investment in the research and development that pushes that productivity frontier sort of further on. So, as someone who is heavily invested in research, I think it's a really important topic because the rate at which farmers can choose the best possible product is ultimately sort of the rate limiting factor for how much impact our jobs have.
And that's going to be really great to go through where we in Australasia sit in context to the rest of the world. We've obviously had this topic in existence in New Zealand for a very long time, and there's always some challenge and noise around this, but I love your high level view that you've already just mentioned, is that it's actually a bit of a feedback loop in general, and you know the potential for getting this wrong is actually quite a big deal to the farming community. So we have mixed messages, we have varying belief structures from people who may even be listening to this podcast, for example. But we've all got to understand that they all create a feedback, a bit like the CO2 in your blood system. They all create a feedback loop that has long-term consequences. So let's dive into your tour and just actually, as we do this, how about sort of just if you could sort of mentally craft a couple of key messages out of the different regions that you went around, and even the techniques or styles of evaluation systems, how they compare to yours and ours are quite in line, just how they compare. So let's go on your world tour. Where did you go first?
Yeah, well, I was lucky enough to visit a few different countries. I focused on the ones that have the most sort of consequential forage markets. So, Argentina, Uruguay, and then various European countries. And the Argentina and Uruguay both have strong histories of independent variety evaluation. Whether it's helping farmers choose the right variety or not is a different story. And then Europe has this really, really interesting story about independent variety evaluation that sort of stems out of post World War II. There was issues with food security, and the EU have legislated that countries will independently evaluate the performance of plant varieties. It's not just forage. So these companies have, wheat evaluation systems and all sorts. So you will evaluate and publish the performance of plant varieties, but they don't tell countries how they need to do it. So you end up with, which is a good thing, you end up with a real patchwork of different systems because every single country has cooked up their own way of complying with those EU requirements. So it's a really interesting case study where you have all different countries' interpretations of how to help their farmers.
Yeah. Dive into the South American one first. And, obviously a landscape with a lot more fescue and short-term ryegrasses.
And alfalfa.
And alfalfa, of course. How would you describe the relativity of their system to ours?
I think that their system is in a very similar spot to the New Zealand and Australian systems in that they have a lot of high quality data and information, but that the impact on farm is going to come through interpreting that and then helping farmers wade through all that information and make good cultivar choices. So they have a really robust system with multi-site evaluation over multiple years. And so they have really fantastic data sets, but for a farmer, trying to interpret those data sets across time and years is quite hard. So they're not in a different spot to us, really, in New Zealand or Australia.
So they've got the resource. It's relatively aligned. Do you believe the style of data being created is in line with the farm systems? Are they being grazed? Are they being cut in a representation of how many grazings you can get in a year? How the farmers may be functioning?
That's a really interesting question. Their systems, like our systems, are the variety evaluation systems have cut and carry trials, where one of the exciting things about our agricultural systems is that they are grazed. So they do have that difference between, I suppose, the way the products are tested and the way the products are used on farm. But that's not necessarily, that's an issue to be overcome in time. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
No, you don't.
You slowly iterate your system to make it better predict on-farm performance.
And I feel we can't lose sight as part of a conversation about testing systems around the world. I mean, we've got to understand that what we're doing is trying to create the most fair system to evaluate genetics in a fair and even and equitable way. And it comes with flaws because it does over protect inefficient material. It probably undervalues high efficiency material. But in New Zealand, we have both grazed and mown trials. So we have grazed and then mown and then grazed and then mown and mown to clean up. The key to those two systems is that farmers really appreciate the grazing elements. When you're trying to be fair and equitable to everything, grazing is a very vulnerable point because all you need to do is graze a little bit lower, i.e. be a little bit more preferred, something that farmers may value. That will then impact their dry matter production for multiple cycles afterwards if you can't even them up to a common height. So you are quite vulnerable with grazing inside an evaluation system, which means it's really hard to create a complete
I guess it will always be, none of these will be perfect, but I guess it's really interesting to come back to the why. And I wonder whether, that's, some of the things that a lot of these evaluation systems, have either missed or haven't got an emphasis on is why are we actually doing this? Because if it's, I think obviously the why should be that we want farmers to make better decisions about the varieties that they put in. If we're just evaluating and publishing results, but not actually understanding the why. And so that means that we do understand that we need to graze in some environments, or this is, in a lot of Europe, for example, the ability to drive big silage yields is a really important, function. And therefore that's what the evaluation systems should reflect. But it's that why are we actually doing this?
Yeah. And if you roll back the why, it's all about how do you incentivize innovation and maximize innovation? So the governments have said we're going to rely on the private sector for plant breeding outcomes. In the 90s, they installed plant breeders' rights, which stimulated some breeding, but they failed to appreciate that you need for a market to function properly, and you need intellectual property rights, and you also need transparent product quality data. And some sectors have done a fantastic job of developing that independent and transparent product quality performance data. For instance, the cereal of GRDC with their national variety trial system in Australia, which gives a wheat grower fantastic information about which variety they should sow. If you're buying lamb or dairy cow genetics, you've got quite an accurate guide as to how they'll affect your profitability. So we need to maximize private sector investment and to subsequently cause maximum genetic gain. You need the intellectual property rights, and you need transparent product quality performance information. And in 0 to 10 years, that's going to optimize farmers' profitability by helping them choose the right varieties. And then 10 to 30 years, that's going to optimize farmers' profitability by causing firms to invest in breeding better and better products.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, going those two aspects of it. One is on-farm performance, but the other clearly is sending signals to investors that there's value in putting money in here.
100%.
Yeah. So the other two sides of this.
And the underlying assumption of my perception of the underlying assumption of most investment decisions that are made by well-meaning bodies around the world in trying to improve the rate of genetic gain in pasture products, for instance, is that science is rate limiting. And science is far from rate limiting. What's rate limiting is the ability for farmers to choose the best pasture products for their farms, which then causes economic incentive and private sector investment.
Yeah, and the time frame it takes to get those products on farm.
Yeah.
So for every year you don't make a decision to put the leading varieties onto your farm, is another year you haven't got an opportunity to get the reward. And the point is, at a renovation rate of 8 to 10%, lucky for many of the industries.
You're lucky to live in a country where it's 8 to 10%.
Yeah, and please hear that, because that's a really big deal. So it's about perspective. 8 to 10% is what we would perceive to be a relatively limited one. Here you are talking about that from an Australian perspective. Admittedly, some of your dairies would be short-term.
100%.
A lot of short-term sowings. So the reality is that they are integrating high-performance Italians and short-termers, but also the perception of value in that space is still exists, and yet the gain could be quite high. But that's still the limitation. So if you don't start, it will take up to 8 to 10 years to put that material into your property to see the benefits of the seasonality, the resilience, or the total production that we may see, or the response to nutrient that we may see from different types. So you can absolutely see it. I think our issue is because of marketing expectations. Everyone thinks you click your fingers and there's big reactions and responses. I think as a whole community, everyone has to take a big deep breath and realize this is a really slow game. I think through the rest of this conversation, we're going to hear 10-year lead-ins, 15-year lead-ins. On farm, you're not going to get a result, because you're going to get a result, but the result is going to come over the next 5 years or 6 years. It's not going to come from your one decision of this year just been. Until you get a critical mass of anything on a property, you can't change your seasonality. You can't change your quality profiles. You can't change your total yields. So I think the message that has not ever been portrayed well is it's so important to get it right, because it all takes so long.
I was just going to come back to that, the comment you made around science not being the rate limiting input here. And I guess, we're not saying that science is not important in things like, different grazing managements or changes to farm systems are still useful in terms of driving productivity. But actually, what we're saying in terms of genetic gain, right, actually that's going to come from the ability to incentivize innovation. And that's going to come from farmers being willing to pick that up and share the value of that
Yeah, and there's so it's an overarching issue called information market failure, and it's where the market can't provide the information because you can't sell it, because you publish your variety list and it's photocopied and given to someone else. So there's no market for that information, but it's still of value because it dictates whether private sector will invest in plant breeding or not. So in situations like that, that is precisely why levy-funded bodies were set up, is to solve market failures, right? So with time, we need to make sure that bodies like Dairy NZ and Dairy Australia and Meat and Livestock Australia fully appreciate the role that these independent valuation systems have on governing the rate of genetic gain in forage products. But at the moment, the dial is largely set towards a belief that fundamental science will solve our genetic gain problems.
Yeah, so just unpack that a little bit. When you say fundamental science, what are some of those things that you would call fundamental science?
Well, the belief that, all we need to do to cause more genetic gain is to optimize a little bit more of this genomic selection, or, all we need to do to optimize genetic gain is to understand a little bit more about this plant and this mechanism. If just some of that money that was spent on fundamental science was diverted towards making sure that the marketplace was super, super competitive by providing farmers fantastic product quality performance data, you'd find that, firms like ours could turn up the dial on investment, which causes genetic gain in plant breeding.
Yeah. So now you come back into we tour around the world, because that's an interaction that goes on in every country. It's a cause and effect. Yeah. So in South America, how would you gauge the pulse of that landscape? We've got colleagues in this world over there, and obviously level of familiarity. What would you gauge their interaction with their data is at the moment?
My perception is that despite the fact that it can be further optimized, it is causing farmers to make decisions that are generally in their interest. In some species, for instance, you see our firm and others, when they want to release a alfalfa or lucerne variety, for instance, they're very conscious of where they are on the list, and they wouldn't be very conscious of where they are on the list if it didn't affect farmers' purchasing decisions. So that's that's great.
That's a beautiful feedback.
Yeah. So that's great. And by the way, the farmers over there that run dairies on lucerne, they have lucerne to the horizon like we have ryegrass to the horizon, and they've got very expensive dairy cattle on it, and it is incredible watching them turn lucerne into milk across their whole platform.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So again, but that there is absolutely where one of those systems that make sure that the varieties they have in those systems, because they are so valuable in terms of creating milk, then
are fit for purpose and meet expectations. Now, let's get on a plane and head to your next stop, which is more general in the sense that you dropped into the EU first, or UK and Ireland?
Yeah, so deliberately visited a series of contrasting variety evaluation systems across Europe because they all spring from the same sort of one sentence mandate in EU legislation, and they've all gone off in different directions.
Yeah, so let's recap that, because we dived into the science, feedback loop and the reaction why. And the why, which also leads straight into this. But let's not lose sight of it. So a fundamental principle was accepted in the EU about trialling systems.
So the EU legislation said you shall run a trialling system. They kind of forgot to say why you'd run a trialling system, and that has meant that by not explicitly stating the purpose, so the objective and the endpoint, countries have gone off in many different directions, only some of which are in the interests of farmers.
Which is a big deal, because then that creates the same feedback loop. Because if the list is still important and it's made to be important by the legislation, you are absolutely embedding 10 to 15 year breeding programs to achieve outcomes from each one of those directives.
Yeah, and then some of those outcomes are about getting on a list, which is your position on which is decided by an algorithm that's designed by a negotiated compromise between potentially people who aren't aligned with farmers' interests.
Yeah, and so more importantly, the decisions, if you're making decision off the list, what you're saying is that decision may not be beneficial to your farm system.
Yeah, that's a really interesting case where your performance on the list has a profound effect on whether you do sell a product or not. So then making sure your list is right and that its rankings are right is critical.
Yeah.
So what's really interesting over there is the way the best systems have evolved, and the best system, I don't know what you'd think, Glenn, but it's probably the one in Ireland. And what is really interesting is the way it got where it is. And my perception of that is that it wasn't an insider or someone who was in the pasture seed industry that caused that to come along. There was a researcher who came into running pasture variety trials from the potato industry, and they had seen the impact that really good variety trial system coupled with data interpretation to help farmers had driven potato productivity. And he came into the Irish grass system and thought, hang on a minute, this is where I'm coming to work every day, I'm running trials, but I'm not achieving the desired outcome, and that's really good decisions. So that was really a turning point for their system, and they turned it from ticking an EU box into helping farmers make really, really good variety decisions. So, and then you've seen the spillover effects of that for Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah. Do you think some of the problem in Europe, I mean, I guess in both New Zealand and Australia, we're based largely off a grazed system, and most of our dairy systems, for example, are very similar in terms of the way they operate. I wonder whether, because Europe operates sometimes when they are being fully fed, sort of a full cut and carry system, and often other times they are in a graze system, whether that does lead to a little bit more complication around which plants might do well in what system. Is there a complicating factor because the farm system is a little more complicated in some of these places?
Yeah, absolutely. But I don't think that's an excuse for not trying to continually iterate your system and make it better. So there's varied uses in Europe, as you know. The Irish they graze a bit more than other nations. If anything, the Europeans have a lot easier job of judging which variety so you just stick a mower at it, and it tells you which one to sow. What's interesting in Europe is that they've left it up to the countries to decide how to build their systems, and environments aren't countries. So you've got these lines on a map, and one country will have a completely different evaluation system to the country next to it, and they might have trials that are 50 kilometres apart, and yet the farmers aren't benefiting from the information. So if they could somehow collaborate more and share their data more, they would end up with a much more robust system.
Oh, wow. And on an era, I'm surprised that those borders are so hard they're easy to cross in general.
So you have countries with multiple different agroclimatic zones, but single lists.
Yeah.
And if they could find a way to collaborate between countries and share their data, the countries, the farmers in country A that have an environment that's similar to farmers in country B would benefit, and they could share data.
Justine, you mentioned Germany has a really good system from an environmental range perspective.
They had what I perceived to be the best system for dealing with the inevitable fact that different varieties may perform differently in different environments. So they had, instead of just having a nationwide system, they'd cut their country up into different agroclimatic zones for the purposes of variety evaluation across all different species, potatoes, wheat, whatever else they grow. So,
And I guess that does stop the issue. And I was privy to one situation where the company that leased the paddock next to the national trialling system and did all their evaluation work kind of next door, almost with the same machines, always seemed to do very well in the list because they were simply mimicking what was happening in the evaluation system. And while they were at the top of the list, that was great, but performance on farm might have been something completely different. So it kind of stops that where you are trialing in different climatic zones, and you're not basically generating information out of one site specifically.
Yeah, if you want to win a trial test where you breed.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I do find it interesting because, when we look at our farmer and growers and users, a lot of what you describe in real terms, because they often in that continental sort of climate zone often don't have a lot of individual events, measurement events. You do really get stuck quite fast into a one outcome type scenario. And if the world changes and you're asked to graze outside more, you're asked to be more efficient from another perspective, fit for purpose, set in concrete doesn't necessarily give you a lot of flexibility from a farmer perspective. If they're heading off in one direction and their system's staying the same, that seems to be a dysfunction in the feedback.
Yeah, and I think that there's in relation to how you evaluate varieties, optimally evaluate varieties, I think there could be a lot more fundamental research. So I think there is a role for fundamental research to be put into how do you run a fantastic variety evaluation system, where at the moment it is there's little reward for academics being involved in these variety evaluation systems. So because it generally doesn't result in publishing something novel, right?
Yeah,
go to work.
Right. Yeah.
Whilst you are helping farmers enormously.
Yeah.
It's not going to get you, a tenure position at a university. So it tends to be ignored by the academic community, despite the fact that it's super important.
Yeah, and amazing data sets.
By
scale.
Yeah.
So if you think about the really good systems and then the systems that are probably not functioning particularly well at all, what are the key, we've talked a little bit about Ireland and I'd agree with you in terms of the way that they've structured that. So we've got things that mimic what's happening on farm, and that information is actually getting to farmers and they can see value in that. What are in terms of the ones that aren't working very well, is it that transfer of information to the farmer that's where the real problem is? What are the,
or the alignment with the farmer?
What are the key things about that distinguish a really good system from a really poor one?
People and leadership.
Yeah.
At the highest level, it's sometimes setting the right objectives for the system. So if you set the objective being farmers making the right decision, then that causes a whole lot of different decisions to setting the objective as run variety trial, publish data. I think,
That's a good statement.
So, and in some instances, a lack of setting the objective for the system can be made up for by really strong people, which you've probably seen in Ireland. They had no EU mandate that said you're going to do a better job by farmers. It was people who drove that. And getting back to your question of what are the differences, largely everyone seems to have the same data sets. It's about how much time and effort someone puts into interpreting those and aggregating those and helping a producer make a decision from the data sets. And then once you got that right, you can enter you can entertain the infinite opportunities to better align, do the way you run your trials, predict on-farm performance.
How important do you think metadata, some of the stuff that sits around the trial, mean temperatures, soil temperatures, fertility, how important do you reckon they are in terms of being able to aggregate some of this information?
Well, short answer to the question is I probably don't know. I'm not an expert on that. But I do know that there's some really interesting work going on. For instance, the work that the Germans did when they demonstrated they used their data and it's self-aggregated into these different agroclimatic zones. That's really important. You look at the work that Dairy Australia are doing at the moment, feed in all your information and let it tell you what environments you have, and they're clearly in some species, they're clearly sorting into different environments. So I think that in order to help farmers make better decisions, I think that the very simplistic data analysis methods that are being used globally in these pasture systems, we could learn a lot from, for instance, GRDC's approach to analysis, where they, a farmer, when they've got a variety ranking in front of them, that's not a trial. That's every trial ever feeding in, taking into account all the correlations. What's driving that? Environment? I don't know.
And technically that's the New Zealand system is a very deep system. That's from a world perspective, we still have a wonderful a data set basically that does try to mine exactly that.
Yeah. So I guess the answer to that is it's very important, but actually by using climatic zones, all of that is kind of aggregated into, you don't actually need to know it. All you need to know is you're grouping them in the right way.
Yeah, but multiple groups.
Absolutely.
And that's the key point. I mean, like we use for marketing purposes, we use a national summary. It's tidy. It condenses down everything into the most minimal amount of trials to get qualified. However, the Grail still sits with the regional information and having confidence that you've trialed enough inside a region to be confident that you can actually represent an outcome in a region.
Yeah.
Which is pretty much the way we run it in New Zealand, but it's quite hard to invest in the qualification phase for an individual region when you've got 5 regions. So the cost structures is really blow out very fast. So the value has to be there. And we invest in it. We qualify in many regions in New Zealand regularly, but that's because we do value those regions as a targeted and unique opportunity.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, the impact of private sector forage plant breeding investment has been remarkable. I mean, you go back and sow a trial that has control varieties from the 1970s, and 80s, and just about every species, and there have been massive gains made in the productivity of these varieties, but we can really turn that up.
Actually, that leads on beautifully.
Because I wonder, and I think it does lead on, but I sort of want to stop on this point is, and often on farm, we don't see that because we haven't sown those old varieties. And recently, we've driven some work where we've gone back to some varieties that were generated in the 1980s, right? And actually, you look at it and you go, of course, there's been improvement, a lot of improvement, but you don't see that because we never go back and sow get that contrast.
Yeah, side by side, and going into that exact same scenario, you had another wonderful topic actually that you published, which I thought was really interesting because it comes exactly to the kernel of exactly what Glenn refers to, is that you obviously were sitting there looking at some trials there one day and had a bit of an epiphany about what was performing in a nutrient deficient environment, and I'll let you take on that little story.
Yeah, I assume you're talking about the nitrogen response work I did.
Which I think is really important because it is a classical flow on.
Yeah.
Because it's all very well us discussing, regional lists and things like that, but one part of what success means in those systems is nutrient response is reflected in those lists, because literally everything is fed the same, and yet they are ranked, and they create ranking and different rankings.
Yeah.
So that would lead on into another publishing topic that you've done in Australia.
Yeah. So back when I worked in agronomy, I became really interested in the idea that, I saw 3-year-old perennial ryegrass trials that we had accidentally under-fertilized. You remove an enormous amount of nitrogen in these cut and carry trials. They're a little bit yellow, but you look at the rankings and the best varieties are the best varieties. And so then you speak to customers and they give you feedback that I can't benefit from sowing elite genetics because I don't feed them like you feed them.
And I reflect that as well. That's a very common statement by farmers is that you need to feed them. And the point is always it's what they miss with that is it's actually not about that. It's about the relativity, which is exactly what your path led you to.
And I suppose, to my knowledge, nobody had asked that question. Do varieties re-rank under different fertility conditions? So we were able to design an experiment that had a range of genotypes from the 1930s through to 2014 when I started the trial, and different endophyte treatments. And we were able to, over multiple years, investigate the implication of your variety choice on your farm's responsiveness to nitrogen fertilizer. And the results were fantastic. It turns out as expected, and the slope of the response functions of all the varieties were enormously different. And we were able to demonstrate that the best variety is the best variety regardless of how much nitrogen you throw at it. And we were also able to demonstrate that in some seasons there's been a more than doubling in the rate at which your pasture will respond to nitrogen applied to it.
And this is a big deal because when you did this, you linked to your local fertilizer industry as well because
so I should give credit to Incitec Pivot and Lee and Craig who helped me with this work. It was a collaboration. And we linked with IPL and
there's a real reason for that too, because like I say, everyone's valuing of the cost of nutrient, particularly nitrogen, is on the base of old response rates in old varieties.
It's really interesting. And to this day, the nitrogen response functions that are used across our entire Australian perennial ryegrass feed base are based on the performance of a variety from 1930, and that variety, through no fault of anyone in 1930, but because it's a European derived Australian naturalised variety. It came from Europe, so it's winter dormant, and then it naturalised to the Australian environment by becoming summer and autumn dormant. So you have an almost perennially dormant cultivar
with a big spring,
and you've done an enormous amount of nitrogen response function work on that. Like the response functions are really tight around the prediction
bodies on the research facilities in those days.
They sponsored agronomic research back in the day, and now the response functions have gone to this. And farmers are probably missing out on a lot of productivity because we haven't.
And by when you say productivity, the point being is that they're still doing the maths on the value of nitrogen based on response rates that represented from the past.
If you've profoundly changed the slope of your nitrogen response or your fertilizer response function, it changes how you should apply nitrogen, how much and when in order to maximize profit. So there's probably some low-hanging fruit for farmers.
So just out of interest, you're telling me, there's a wee mic drop moment for me just then, you're telling me that still hasn't impacted the current knowledge base?
No, it has not.
So you're telling me that after you've published this paper, given some empirical truth, that the response rates to nitrogen on perennial pasture in Australia are still modelled off or representing the genetics that work was first published?
Yes, it takes a long time from information to go from a paper to on-farm practice change.
That blows my mind because that hits to a key part of what I feel is such a compromising part of the industry at the moment, which is the level of validation you require to actually make changes in the modern era. And it's like a self-fulfilling circle of slowness associated with how much validation are we going to need to change a very fundamental decision tool on farm, which is this response rate to nitrogen.
And it would be a low-hanging fruit for, I think, Australian dairy farmers if those guidelines were reevaluated in light of modern genetics, because there's opportunity there.
We must investigate the New Zealand scenario based on that, to be quite frank.
What strikes me also, and it's to your point here, is there was some work that was done in Ireland over a number of different years, and what the question was: do varieties re-rank if we add clover?
Right.
And so what we're doing is we're essentially adding a nitrogen source there, and again they found exactly the same thing. Varieties do not re-rank whether they have or don't have clover. And again, so you can imagine that there's some different nitrogen backgrounds in those two treatments, and yet we've got good varieties.
To be fair, in the New Zealand context, we haven't found that. So in the New Zealand context, the reason we've kept our clovers out of our ryegrass trialling system is because you tend to find that your common management means that your highest performing grasses suppress clover, and your lowest performing grasses release clover, and clover becomes the moderator of the two results. And so our problem is that if our most advanced grasses were harvested to their immediate time frame, they would be just as good as the low, but they often aren't. They often accumulate too higher covers and compromises. So we've got data on that through the 90s and early 2000s. It was very, very clear. It was a long-term discussion between a few of our senior agronomists back in the day, is that we took the clover out of our grass-based systems because our pre-grazing management consistently disadvantaged the highest performers, over-advantaged the lowest performers, and therefore you actually just got a table that came even closer together, which was artificial because we could have managed better for the high performers.
The other really interesting piece that came out of the nitrogen response work was we had a variety, a tetraploid perennial ryegrass variety with and without AR37.
Oh, yeah, the endophyte.
Yeah. So we incubated the endophyte out and we tested with and without AR37, and the AR37 paid for itself in a couple of harvests in its additional response to nitrogen.
Yeah.
It was, I can't remember the exact number, but it's a large increase.
I could imagine
in the amount of grass you grow through for every kilo of nitrogen you put on.
Yeah.
So I guess the mechanism there is we're saying here's something that's not nearly as susceptible to some of the pasture bugs.
Yeah, in the case of Australia.
And therefore has the ability to convert that nitrogen to extra.
And it's always been seen to have slightly higher root mass in the summer and autumn, and recovery has been and when recovery is such an integral part of utilising autumn nitrogen to get into winter, that would have almost paid for itself in that moment.
It wouldn't surprise me if you could link independent pasture variety evaluation system to nitrogen recommendations, because the slope just gets cranked up as you get better varieties. So if that turns out to happen predictably, it wouldn't be hard to have a reasonably a guideline that got close to optimizing a farmer's recommendation just based on the off the variety trials.
I would agree with that too. It's another way of looking at even, I wouldn't say validation. I would say another form of value associated with the common data set. I mean, I look at data, they're there to give you an idea of seasonality, idea of resilience over time, disease. They're not there to answer every question, but one thing is common. They're given a common nutrient. So, and they're creating slightly different results, and therefore they are reacting to that nutrient in slightly different ways.
Here's a question, and you might not be able to answer this, but do you think that the increased dry matter production from this nitrogen in our new varieties, do you think that's a consequence of the breeding, right? So actually they are more nitrogen use efficient, and therefore we get more dry matter out of that, right? Or is it actually the result of the breeding and the high dry matter production, right? That makes us more nitrogen use efficient. So is it
a chicken and egg question? Yeah. Isn't that a chicken and egg question?
Well, it is. It is.
Well, yeah. So we flipped the numbers upside down and analysed them. Analysed nitrogen uptake based on the protein percentage that we analysed, and my interpretation of those results were that it's a consequence of breeding for increased yield. We didn't see lower nitrogen percentage. So that also has environmental implications, right?
Yeah.
So the better varieties took up and turned into protein more of the applied nitrogen.
Yeah. Hunger and drive to capture was greater.
Yeah.
And, I think it's an unintentional consequence that I feel, from a listener perspective, what I'd always ask people to remember is that what you see as essential today possibly may not have, or a topic of great interest today may not have existed 10 years ago in the framing of it, that you framed it then. And so we are entering a new era where actually the unintentional consequences of just breeding for more yield and elite yield is now linked to other environmental traits such as nitrogen use and subsequent efficiencies. Doesn't mean to say that can't be a trait that is actually honed in and focused on why over the next 10 to 15 years. And so not just yield, but what are the mechanisms to allowing you to achieve those yields under a common nutrient use? And if there's mechanisms, if we hone in on them, maybe we can create great things in the next 10 to 15 years.
Certainly, there's certainly some opportunity there.
Quite exciting.
Well, I'll tell you what, this last 50 minutes has flown by.
And Martin was worried.
Yeah.
He obviously hasn't sat in the room with us that often.
So I guess as a recap, I think this has been a really fascinating journey through evaluation systems around the world, more around the good ones and the ones that probably are still really functional, but may not be having the right outcomes.
Yeah, and only reviewed at a high level and a high force, of course.
Yeah, zoom out and get your purpose right. Why are you getting out of bed? Why are you running that system? And get that purpose right, and then good things flow from getting that right.
Yeah, and
I like that.
Yeah, and then I think there's a really important message around that the dial in terms of where that fundamental science can really have an impact, and how much impact that can have. So I think it's been a really important point. And then I think from a nitrogen use perspective, I think it's as you said, Alistair, a mic drop moment where we're saying that some of the data that we use to drive fertilizer recommendations are based off varieties that just aren't appropriate anymore.
Can you imagine if your animal feeding recommendations were based on the performance of a 1930s dairy cow?
Or even fuel efficiency based on a 1970s car.
Yeah, or even me being a 1970s human. So the efficiency have got a whole lot better, haven't they?
Yeah, they got.
To be fair, so listen,
all becoming more inefficient.
Yeah, far more inefficient. Anyway, listen. Thank you, Martin. This has been a really fascinating walk through those couple of topics. Really appreciate you coming in and giving your perspective on things. I've got a lambing beat to do, Alistair, so we're gonna have to end this year. I'm pretty sure most of them will be triplets because it's a high performing
lifestyle block.
But thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Madam.
Thanks.
This podcast is powered by Agricom. For more specific advice, contact your local Agricom rep or visit agricom.co.nz.